So what are then the postures of these 325,000 churches when it comes to disability? And what are the postures of the communities in which our churches are located? And so I thought to illustrate this and provide context for our conversation specifically around thinking about youth ministry, that it might be helpful to share a short bit of history around the ways our country and society has thought about disability and community in reference to people with disabilities. So hope you will bear with a little bit of blunt history as we go through this, because I think looking backwards helps us kind of see where our own ministries might be in the stream of this history and where we might go next. And I'll use my own lifespan of just about 50 years here as kind of a point of reference. So at the time I was born in the early 1970s, young people with intellectual disability were still excluded from so many aspects of community life. You might not know, but they were excluded from local public schools, from so many workplaces, from neighborhoods, and so many other activities. And as we thought about our communities, that meant there were holes. Communities were incomplete because people weren't present. Well, things began to change pretty dramatically in the 70s and then in the 80s as new spaces and new programs began to be created for children and adults with intellectual disability to learn and to work and to live and recreate and worship. But actually, so often the opportunities that were born in a response to exclusion were almost always provided in separate settings, apart from any other person who didn't have that same disability label. And that was the de facto choice. It was made without ever meeting you. And sometimes those options of separateness were the only choice. And so still, in most communities, everyday life was lived away from people with intellectual disability. Well, in the 80s and then the 90s, the time I was going through elementary and then middle school and even into high school, the shift was really towards ensuring that people with disabilities were integrated within ordinary aspects of community life. So our schools, our businesses, residential programs, recreational programs all began to grow exponentially, really. But what we saw so often is that the opportunities that emerged in these different locations, including in our churches, still involved a certain separation. Self-contained or separate classrooms in schools, or work enclaves, or large group homes that were in a community but tucked in parts of the community that people rarely went. And so often we saw is that people with developmental disabilities were near, but not really among their peers without disabilities. And there's a big difference between being near one another and being among one another. And that takes us to the present day, where the last really 2 decades, as we've thought about our postures and of community in relation to developmental disability, has shifted towards inclusion. The full inclusion of people in the same classrooms and clubs and colleges and church activities and community groups as anyone else. Inclusion, it's from I think another way of thinking about this movement of prepositions, from being apart from one another to being among one another to now being with one another. And those prepositions really do matter. Well, there's one actual additional destination I think that I would add to this list that maybe you've seen in some ways in various variations, at least in my view. When I talk with youth and young adults with developmental disabilities who are part of our college campus here at Vanderbilt, part of the programs and schools, they talk about wanting to be more than just merely integrated or even included. They talk about wanting to belong. We long to belong. And there's something past mere inclusion that I think is a destination we're still working towards. It's about being part of a community where we are seen as indispensable, where we start to see one another in fundamentally different ways, not as the ins and the outs, the members and the strangers, the ones who are labeled and those who are the labelers or who are not, but we're one community, one faith community, one community, diverse, absolutely, but every person of equal and immeasurable value, where every person is known and accepted and needed. But it's not just a community that sees one another different that marks belonging. It also means we do more than just share space. We also share our lives. We become knitted together and woven into relationships, and we stay involved in each other's lives after class ends, beyond the benediction, after we dismiss from our youth group, after we clock out of work. We stay engaged in each other's lives all 7 days of the week, where every person is now befriended and supported and loved. So do you see, as we look at this progression, some of the differences in these portraits over time historically? And do you see the difference between mere inclusion and belonging? The difference between being present in a place or in a group and having a presence in that place or group? Or for our congregations, it's the difference between welcoming youth with disabilities who arrive and welcoming their presence versus actually aching because of their absence and pursuing people who aren't yet there. So I share these 5 portraits actually not as a history lesson. I wasn't totally truthful. It does reflect where we've been and how we've moved along the way. But it actually turns out these portraits aren't past history. They're actually living history. What you see on the screen is really the current landscape of disability and ministry within the contemporary church. In fact, these are the prevailing models of ministry we see across those 300,000+ churches in the United States, many more around the world, where we see examples abound of congregations that are marked by exclusion or separation or integration of those with developmental disabilities and other disabilities as well, and a much smaller, but fortunately growing number of churches that are being described as places of true inclusion and deep belonging. So I hope that helps you begin to kind of picture some of the ways that we think about communities or live out communities when it comes to young people with developmental disabilities. And what I've just done here is now folded in some additional language or ways of talking about these portraits that might connect a bit more to how we think about life as a church. These are drawn from Bill Gaventa, who's been a real leader in this area of disability and ministry, who talks about this movement of prepositions, that we're going from ministry apart from people with disabilities to ministry to ministry among, to ministry with, and to ministry with and by young people with disabilities. So I hope this is prompting your own reflection. And in fact, we're going to go into some brief breakout rooms for you to be able to share some of your reactions to this series of portraits. As you think about the congregations that you lead or the ministries that you lead and are part of, as you think about disability, I wonder which of these portraits or multiple portraits kind of depict what you see in your midst. And so kind of where are you right now in your own congregation or in your ministry? And we will come back and talk about where we go next and how we move forward into that space of inclusion and belonging. All right, well, welcome back. I hope that was a fruitful time just to reflect and begin to situate yourself in terms of sort of this broader history, but also to anchor it to where are we right now as a congregation and where do we want to go next? What kind of community do we want to be marked by as we move forward in this space? So let's begin to park now more on this last destination of inclusion and belonging.